So I'm Jen. I'm a self-taught front-end developer. Or as Moana says, I'm self-taught, and I'm currently a software engineer at Eventbrite. We're sponsoring this conference. You may know me as the creator of Human Wasteland, also known as the poop map of San Francisco. If you don't know what that is, feel free to ask me about it afterwards. Or you might know me as the creator of Developers, which is my dedication to Mr. Steve Ballmer. So all of that is just a long-winded way of saying that I write code for a living. So when I first started speaking in 2014, it was actually at a PHP conference, and the last conference I spoke at was a PHP conference. So I have a lot of love for PHP. And since I've been in Italy, I've been feeling a lot like this. You might say that's kind of like the JavaScript community these days, too. So some quick disclaimers. There are going to be a lot of animated GIFs in this talk. There might be some errors. So you might feel a little bit like this, like, hey, wait up just a minute here. But before you start to get a little bit more like this, let's talk about it. But let's talk about it after the talk. Oops, so let's go. As I said, I am a developer, software engineer, programmer, or whatever else you want to call me. So some days when I look at my computer, I feel a lot like this. I don't even know what the hell this means. And sometimes when I'm in conversations with other developers, I feel a lot like this. Wait, what? So Phil Carlton once said there are two hard things in computer science, and those two things are cache invalidation and naming things. And we can see that in the various vocabulary that we have in web development and computer science. So here's a smattering of words that when I first saw them, I was like, I think I might know what somebody's talking about, but I'm not really sure what those things mean. And so when I would ask somebody, when I was in conversation with them, I would often get a look that was like this. And that made me feel like this. So as I said, there's a lot of crazy words in computer science and web development that oftentimes don't make sense to you if you're first starting to learn. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about them because a lot of these words actually have origins outside of computer science. And so sometimes don't make a lot of sense when translated into computer science. So I'm hoping today by talking about them, you'll feel a little bit less like Urkel and a little bit more like Brent Rambo. All right, so to start off, we're going to talk about parameter versus argument. What's the difference, and is there one? And so naturally, I went to Google to find out if that was true. Is there a difference? And you'll see that it's the third search down. So a lot of people have this question. What's the difference? So I have a function here. It's called shark. And you'll see that at the beginning, the first line, I have the word side. And then at the very bottom in the function call, I have a string left. So how many people think that that first line where side is, that side is the parameter? Raise your hand. And then how many think that it's the string left in the last line? Raise your hand. And obviously I raised my hand both times, so you'll find out later what the correct answer is. So when I look up parameter on the online etymology dictionary, and etymology is essentially the history of words, you'll see that they define a parameter as a measurable factor which helps to define a particular system. And then you'll see that argument is just kind of information about arguing with other people. So that's not very helpful. And then when I look up a parameter on Wikipedia, what I see in computer science is that the term parameter, sometimes called the formal parameter, is often used to refer to a variable as found in the function definition, while argument, sometimes called the actual parameter, refers to the actual input passed into that function. So I was looking at it and I was like, why don't we use the words formal parameter and actual parameter anymore? Why do we use parameter and argument? And to find out that answer, you kind of have to go down the rabbit hole. So we're going to start off with math, again defined in Wikipedia. So in mathematical functions, the definition can also contain parameters. But unlike the variables, parameters are not listed among the arguments that the function takes. And I was like, wait, what? What does that mean? So Wikipedia, I'm like, okay, please go on. So they say that the variable x designates the function's argument, but that a, b, and c are the parameters. So you see here in this mathematical function that x is the argument, and that a, b, and c are the parameters. So both are helping define the function here. I was like, wait a second. So in math, a is the parameter, and then in computer science or web development, bar is the parameter. I was like, whoa, that's totally wrinkling my brain. So I like to explain it by showing this GIF and saying that this dog is a parameter, the football, American football, is computer science, and so when the parameter hits computer science, its definition gets flipped completely on its end. So all that being said, the takeaway is that parameters help define a function and arguments are passed into a function. So for those of you who raised your hand, for the first line side, that is the parameter, you're correct, and then you'll see that the string left is the argument. So again, all of that being said, parameter and argument are often used interchangeably. So that was easy, right? Easy as childbirth is what it says. All right, next up is scope. So when somebody asks me to talk about scope, this is how I feel. I'm like, oh God, please don't make me talk about scope. I really don't want to talk about scope. But I'm going to talk about it today. So we'll start off by defining lexical scope on Google. So Google says lexical scoping, sometimes known as static scoping, is a convention used with many programming languages that sets the scope or range of functionality of a variable so that it may only be called or referenced from within the block of code in which it is defined. And when I first read that, that's how I felt. I was like, wait, what? In that one definition, you have three other definitions where they say that lexical scoping is also called static scoping, scope is also called range of functionality, and called is also referenced. And I was like, oh man, that's kind of a lot. And then they actually use the word scope in the definition of lexical scoping. So you have to know what scope is first before you even can learn what lexical scoping is. So let's break it down a little bit. So again, I went to the online etymology dictionary and saw that scope means an aim, a purpose, object, thing aimed at, mark, or target. I was like, oh, that's not really super helpful. So then I went to Wikipedia and we see that a scope is a part of a program that is or can be the scope for a set of bindings. A precise definition is tricky, see below. Thanks a lot, Wikipedia. So I keep reading and I see that in computer science, the scope of a name binding, an association of a name to an entity, such as a variable, is a part of a computer program where the binding is valid, where the name can be used to refer to the entity. And I was like, okay, well, I already know what scope is, having been a web developer for so many years. So I'd say that definition is not too bad. Because it's like, well, if you're new to programming, that definition won't really help you that much. So if I keep reading on Wikipedia, we see that there's scope again. And they say that the strict definition of lexical scope of a name or identifier is unambiguous. And I was like, wow, that's kind of condescending, Wikipedia. You're saying it's unambiguous and I should just know. But it says that it is, quote, the portion of source code in which a binding of a name to an entity applies. And I was like, oh, okay, that's pretty straightforward. We've got it in one phrase, and that should make sense to a lot of people. But then I saw that it's been virtually unchanged since the 1960s definition in the specification for algol 60. I don't know if anybody here knows what algol 60 is, but I sure didn't when I read this definition. So algol 60 is short for the algorithmic language of 1960. And it was the first language implementing nested function definitions with lexical scope. So we've had the definition of lexical scope since 1960. Oops, going backwards a little bit. 1960, exclamation point, but we still can't explain scope. It's so hard to explain. Okay, now we're going to talk about lexical versus dynamic scope. And Wikipedia says that lexical scope is the main focus of that article, but with dynamic scope understood in contrast to lexical scope. So again, you actually need to know what lexical scope is before you can know what dynamic scope is. All right, is everybody with me still? I know the party's coming up pretty soon. Okay, so lexical in the online etymology dictionary is defined as pertaining to words. It's like, okay, that's not really helpful to me. Whereas dynamic is defined as pertaining to a force producing motion, and it's the opposite of static. So if you remember earlier in our Google definition of lexical scope, it was also compared to the term static scoping. So it's like, oh, okay, so lexical scoping, static scoping, opposite of dynamic scope. Kind of makes a little bit of sense. So again, Wikipedia says, for most programming languages, part of a program refers to a part of the source code or area of text. And here we've got lexical scope, related to words. So it says area of text. And it's known as the lexical scope. Whereas in some languages, part of a program actually refers to the portion of runtime or time period during execution, and that's known as dynamic scope. And then I kept reading and I was like, wait, both of these terms are somewhat misleading. They misuse technical terms as discussed in the definition. I was like, okay, wait, so that definition's wrong. But the distinction itself is accurate and precise, and these are the standard respective terms. I'm like, wait, is the definition right? I'm like super confused now. So I keep reading, and it says that in practice, with lexical scope, a variable's definition is resolved by searching its containing block or function. And then if that fails, you search the outer containing block or the outer function, and so on. Whereas with dynamic scope, the calling function is searched, then the function which called that, calling function, and so on. So that's the difference between lexical and dynamic. And like all that being said now again, we often dynamic scope is typically much less used than lexical scope. So again, I have another GIF to explain lexical scope. And the way we have it is, so that box is a function, and like the white cat can't see the orange cat, but the orange cat can see the white cat, which is in global scope. All right. Next up is recursion. So recursion in the online etymology dictionary is defined as essentially a running backwards or to return. And it's like, okay, well, I kind of know what recursion is, so that makes a bit of sense. And then Wikipedia says that the most common application of recursion is in mathematics and computer science, in which it refers to a method of defining functions in which the function being defined is applied within its own definition. I was like, wow, that's a lot of defining for just one definition. So I kept reading, and we see specifically this defines an infinite number of instances or function values using a finite expression that for some instances may refer to other instances, but in such a way that no loop or infinite chain of references can occur. Whew. Okay. So further down in that definition, we see that in mathematics or computer science, a class of objects or methods exhibit recursive behavior when they can be defined by two properties. Number one, a simple base case or cases, a terminating scenario that does not use recursion to produce an answer. And then number two, a set of rules that reduce all other cases towards that first base case. And again, since I kind of know what recursion is, I'm sure a lot of you do as well as web developers, that definition makes some sense. But if you're new and you don't really understand what recursion is yet, that maybe wouldn't make so much sense. So I say again, this definition's okay. So what I like to say is that recursion is just a function that calls itself. And when I say that, people are like, well, what about infinite recursion? And I'm like, well, that's still recursion, it's just you're doing it wrong. So a lot of people, when I ask them to define recursion for me, they like immediately reference the Fibonacci sequence. And like, I haven't taken math in over a decade. I'm kind of dating myself, but I don't even remember what the Fibonacci sequence is. So I'm like, that definition doesn't really help me too much. One of my friends recently told me, actually, you can define recursion by factorials. And we all like factorials because they have this awesome exclamation point. I'm a fan of exclamation points, as you can tell. And so when I was first explained that factorials explain recursion, it's like, oh, that's awesome. I'm really into that definition. All right, next is concatenation. And you'll see that a concatenation essentially means a linking together or to link together things in a chain. And I was like, oh, we totally used concatenation correctly in computer science and web development. Yes, we did it right. So I was like, okay, that's awesome. But really, I just want to talk about this word because it's got the word cat in it. And this is my cat. And here's a recursive cat. All right, next up is instantiate. So the online etymology dictionary says that that essentially means that it comes from an instant, and it's related to instantiated or instantiation. And I'm like, okay, that's not super helpful. So we went to Google, and then I took a look, and it says that instantiate means to represent as or by an instance. And it shows an example, and it says, a study of two groups who seem to instantiate productive aspects of this. And I was like, wait, this what? As if this isn't confusing enough in JavaScript. So I found out that instantiation actually comes from philosophy. So in Wikipedia, you see that in predicate logic, universal instantiation, also called UI, and I was like, oh, is that user interface? It's also called the universal specification or universal elimination, and it's sometimes confused with dictum de omni. It's a valid rule of inference about a truth about a member of a class of individuals to a truth of that particular individual of that class. So to explain it again in relation to cats, all cats are mammals. Fry is a cat. Fry is my cat. Fry is a cat, and therefore Fry is a mammal. So I have here just like a class definition using fancy new ES6 here. So what I'm defining here is a class mammal, and you'll see that cat, the class cat, inherits from mammal, and then I instantiate a new cat and let that be equal to my Fry cat. So we actually have instantiation in development, and it's the same as the idea in philosophy. However, weirdly, on online etymology dictionary, instantiation redirects to instantiate, and then on Wikipedia, instantiate redirects to instantiation. So I'm not really sure which version of the word is correct. Is it the verb or is it the noun? I don't know. Okay, next are acronyms. So I still always get these confused, CRM, CMS, and CDN. So CRM, just to remind everyone, is a customer relationship manager, kind of like Salesforce. CMS is a content management system. It's kind of like WordPress. And then a CDN is a content delivery network, kind of like Amazon CloudFront. Okay, next is Sass versus Sass. So please clarify to me which one you're talking about. Are you talking about software as a service, like Salesforce, or are you talking about syntactically awesome style sheets, like the CSS extension language? Okay, next is Dom. So this is Dom, which is a cathedral in Austria. This is Dom, it's an American indie band. This is the Dom, which is a mountain in the Pennine Alps. And again, we see that word Sass. So there's lots of kinds of Dom. But we know that the DOM we're talking about as web developers is the document object model. And Wikipedia here says that it's a cross-platform and language-independent convention for representing and interacting with objects in HTML, XHTML, and XML documents. And I'm like, that kind of makes sense to me, but I'd like a little more formal or, explanatory definition of DOM. So I went to MDN, or Mozilla Developers Network, and we see that the DOM is a programming interface for HTML, XML, and SVG documents. It provides a structured representation of document and defines a way that the structure can be accessed from a program so that you can change the document and its style. And then again, or rather, MDN also shows this nice little tree. So that's the DOM. Okay, next is GUI or GUI versus CLI or CLI, as I like to call it. So when I think of GUI, I think of ooey gooey butter cake, and then I get really hungry. Or I think of a gooey duck, which is a bivalve that lives in the ocean. And then when I think of CLI, I think of Klee, or the painter, Paul Klee. But really, we know that we're talking about the graphical user interface, which were first introduced in reaction to the perceived steep learning curve of command line interfaces, or CLIs. So that's GUI versus CLI. And lastly here, I have Ajax. So we know what Ajax stands for, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. But number one, who even uses XML anymore? Am I right? Another thing that I thought was weird is that jQuery's Ajax method actually has an option to set async to false. So you might be running sjaj, synchronous JavaScript, and JSON. So in conclusion, a lot of times when you're learning these programming concepts, you at first have no clue. You have no idea what these things mean, and you're like, what is this? It makes no sense. And then at some point in time, you're just like, whoa, I just get it. I suddenly just get it. And you don't really remember the path which you took to get there. You just understand it. So that can be really hard to explain to someone who's new and doesn't understand that concept. But I really implore you, try not to be like this when someone asks you a question. Don't you understand anything? Try to be, actually, also don't be like this, which is like, no, ask that guy. I don't know. I don't feel like explaining it to you. Try to be a little bit more like this. You got it. I'm totally going to explain this to you, and I'll help you out. Because it's really difficult learning new stuff. So here you see a video of a bunch of little hockey players. Number 12 has fallen on the ice over here. And she just can't get up. There's all these people, and she's like, everyone's talking about GUI. I don't know what GUI means, though. They're just talking about it, and I just really need some help. So you see other number 12 coming over, and she's like, let me help you. I'll explain what GUI is. I'll give you a hand. GUI is the graphical user interface. And first number 12 is like, thank you. I finally understand what GUI is. So when we're all a little bit more like these number 12s on the ice, we can party together in the JavaScript and computer science jargon land. Thanks.